AI is, in my opinion, dramatically underhyped right now. We're seeing massive actual revenue and impact without that much adoption.
How are you able to keep winning again and again and again with these early stage investments?
They just happen to be some of the biggest companies: Airbnb, and Stripe, Coinbase, and Figma, and Instacart. I think where people misunderstand AI right now, really this is a revolution in terms of units of cognition. When you had GPT 3.5 and you went to 4, suddenly legal opened up as a vertical. Eventually you're going to hit a point where it can do all of human services.
CEO and co-founder. Elad Gil, the founding partner of Now I'm here, co-founder Elad Gil.
We have something special for episode 100 of American Optimist. Elad Gil has been a friend for a long time. He's one of the great thinkers, great investors in Silicon Valley. We go really deep on AI, on history of the tech world, on what's coming up next in the next 10, 20 years. You know, Elad's funds is one of the funds I am the most bullish on. He's just involved in so many of the best companies over the last 20 years and already probably involved in things that will become the most famous companies in the next decade. Excited for you to meet him. I'm Joe Lonzil. Welcome to American Optimist. Have my friend Elad Gil with us here today. I'm really glad you're here. Thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me. It's great to see you.
So Elad, I want to start with your background. Tell us a little bit about your upbringing. How'd you make it to Silicon Valley?
Sure. Yeah, I moved out to the Bay Area originally for a job. I joined a startup sort of right at the end of the telecom or the dot-com boom and sort of bust. And unfortunately, I had perfectly bad timing and I showed up right as everything was collapsing. And I worked at a telecom equipment startup, and that went through a series of layoffs. I was kind of laid off in the 5th round.
This is like right at the end of the bubble then.
It was right at the end of the bubble, and we grew from 120 to 150 people and then shrank to 13 people.
Wow. And you were still there. You were one of the 13 they kept.
No, I got cut around 50 or so. So I was in the 3rd round.
There you go.
So I made it through 2 rounds, in fact. But it was a pretty brutal environment. Everything was kind of collapsing. It was actually very good. It was very formative, right? Because if you've been through a layoff and a really tough time like that, and I was straight out of school, so I didn't have any money. And so I remember even as that company was ramping up, I was like, this is not sustainable. Like, I don't know how this thing is going to survive. And so I remember me and a friend of mine used to go to the grocery store every week, once a week, and we'd buy like a loaf of bread and a thing of cheese. And I just eat cheese sandwiches for every meal, like all week. Cause it was like, I was saving money cause I thought this layoff was coming and I'm like, how am I going to live? Right.
Wow. So you knew it was coming and you're saving as much
you
cash
did the
as you
math.
could.
Yeah. You just looked at their burn and you looked at their cash and you're like, they have to do layoff.
How'd you know? Most engineers aren't like aware of those financial things. How do you know to be aware?
I don't know. It just felt like math to me, honestly. Like it's just, you start thinking about it and you're like, these things seem off. And then you do the math and you're like, okay, we're going to run out of money in 12 months or whatever if they don't do something. So they have to do something. And it's kind of funny how if you just look at certain things from first principles or you just look at data, you're like, oh, of course this thing is this way.
Did you become an entrepreneur after you got laid off?
No, I ended up eventually making my way to Google. Google at the time was sort of scaling and it was soaking in all the talent in Silicon Valley, or at least all the entrepreneurial talent. And so I joined there and I ended up working on 2 things. One is I helped buy in the Android team and start a lot of the early mobile efforts. Yep. And then second, I worked on some early AI and machine learning for ads targeting related products. I worked more on the product side. And then after that, I left to start a company and sold that to Twitter. And then I worked at Twitter for a bunch of years and then started another company. So
what were the lessons from building a team at Google on the mobile side? Like, what did you guys, that was obviously a pretty important team for Google. What did you do?
Yeah, at the time, Larry Page was still very active at Google and he decided to get rid of all middle managers. And so when I joined, he removed like 3 management layers and suddenly every director or VP level person had 50 to 100 people working directly for them. And so they had no ability to actually meet with the team that worked for them, right? Because how can you meet with 100 people?
Would you bring them together or what did you do?
No, basically you had this giant gray market for talent where you could go do whatever you want because nobody was paying attention, right? So it was actually, for me, it was great. And so I recruited a lot of the early mobile team without their managers knowing, because their managers didn't know what they were doing. So they just come and start working with me on mobile. And so we kind of organically built this, I don't know what to call it, like this team of pirates or something.
I mean, this is kind of insane. Is this because the Google is making so much money? I like to think of Google as like this gusher of money, oil, and then there's people like all around it, and it's just kind of a mess, and so you're able to do stuff.
I mean, it was basically a golden era where Silicon Valley had just gone through a major depression. Huge layoffs had happened. A bunch of companies had blown up. Founders were sort of out in the street. And Google just soaked in all the very, very best talent of that era.
But then also just let it do whatever it wanted.
Up to a point, yeah. I mean, eventually they put back in middle management and, they did a bunch of reorgs and realigned everything. But it was a very, if you want to go start something, if you can convince one of a handful of people, then you could go do it.
So you're kind of like an entrepreneur inside of Google, basically.
Yeah, and I never think that you see how hard it is to really be an entrepreneur, and you're like, well, no big
not
company
the
really
same.
has entrepreneurs, but yeah, it was basically you had this gray market for talent. People could just start all sorts of things, and that's when you had this big expansion. And Google used to have this web page up that was like, here's all the things we're never going to do. And it said, we're never going to do IM or chat. We're never going to do a browser. We're never going to, and it ended up doing all those things,
That's
right? We're never going
funny.
to do satellites. It was supposed to be like
That's-
this exaggerated, funny thing.
That's
right?
funny. So I had this thing we're never going to do, and they did all of them.
They ended up doing basically everything.
Even the dopey evil. I'm just kidding. You can't
Yeah.
say that.
Yeah, so it was a very dynamic time, and I feel like at any given moment in time, there's one or two companies that are going through this kind of golden age period where you're expanding rapidly, you're soaking in all the best talent, you're launching multiple product lines, you have this diversity of stuff happening. And then often those cohorts of people go off to then do amazing things in Silicon Valley later. And so maybe right now that's OpenAI, maybe that's Stripe. There's a handful of companies that are probably these.
Ramp seems a little bit like that too
Yeah.
in some ways. But going back again, so why'd you leave to start a company after Google?
Yeah, I always wanted to start a company. It's just because I had worked at a startup that failed, I had no money, right? I was just out of school.
Yeah.
So
So you made enough money at Google to go do it.
yeah, and I think before the current era, it was actually really hard to start companies, right? There weren't that many people funding it. There wasn't Y Combinator or these accelerator programs where you could just go and people would give you some money to get going. There weren't very many angel investors. There wasn't information online about how to do it.
You had to eat cheese sandwiches for months to
You
save
had
the
to-
money.
No, seriously, right?
Yeah.
Like I was literally paying off school debt.
Yeah.
And so you're very constrained, and I feel we're in a much less constrained environment now because seed capital is much easier to raise, which means that really smart people can just show up, get some money, and start doing things at a very young age.
In some ways, though, if to be an entrepreneur back then, there was a higher bar, wasn't there? Or for a lot of people.
It definitely seems like it was harder, and I don't know if that's just me being an old person now and saying,
Yeah.
it's always harder when I was young or
We had
whatever.
to walk both ways uphill in the snow.
Yeah, but it was dramatically. It was really hard to get something up and running back then, or even convince people to quit and go do it because there weren't that many startup successes until especially after the dot-com bubble where everything collapsed.
Yeah.
People took away the lesson of, all these things are kind of fake companies, and I want to go somewhere that's stable.
Yeah, no, totally. I remember when hiring for Palantir, it was like there's a lot higher bar to convince people for quite a while. What was the company you started when you first
Yeah,
left?
the first company I started was called Mixer Labs. It basically ended up being a data infra platform company. Before there was a lot of those for mainly for developers to use, or so for engineers to basically build different applications. We ended up selling it to Twitter when Twitter was about 90 people.
Twitter
And
really needed some help back then, is my recollection.
Twitter was a mess, right? And it's kind of funny because as you see multiple companies go from 50 or 100 people to thousands of people, you see that almost all of them have these phases where they're a mess or something really bad was happening, or serial things or problems had to be dealt with. Twitter was especially bad.
Yeah, Twitter seems uniquely bad. For me, the thing I've heard, and you could tell me maybe it's too mean, but it's like, I mean, I think Mark Zuckerberg, by the way, called it a clown car that fell into a gold mine, which is a little, that's pretty mean, but it's pretty funny.
Yeah.
The thing I heard is that I like to say that you don't get billion-dollar companies without really top tech cultures, except for Twitter's like the exception that proves the rule.
I can think of a couple others. So I think my big lesson over the last couple of years is that product market fit matters above everything else. In other words, if there's an active market that really wants to use what you're doing, it'll put up with a lot of stuff unless there's a very clear alternative.
The fail whale.
The fail whale was up constantly and the thing kept growing, right? And there'd be articles about the fail whale and that would just boost growth. And so Twitter was in this magic moment where what it was doing was very unique and defensible. And honestly, I mean, it survived to this day as now X under Musk, but it survived for 20 years as something that wasn't very well run for much of that history.
When you came in, did you guys fix some things there at least?
We fixed so much stuff. So Twitter was in a state where you mentioned the fail whale days. Basically what that was is the site kept going down and they put up a picture of a very cute whale, like a graphic, and that was their product because you couldn't log in or anything because the site was down because they couldn't deal with the traffic. At the same time, when we were bought, they couldn't, what's known as deploy code, they couldn't update the website. And they hadn't been updating it for weeks. They just didn't know how to update the code. And so we went in and we fixed that deploy queue. And that was the first, my team was supposed to go and build all this stuff for the ecosystem and developers.
You just had to
and
fix the
apps,
basics
and
first.
We just had to come in and fix the basics, yeah.
Wow.
It was a mess,
How long
yeah.
did you stay there?
I was there 2.5 years full time and then another year as an advisor. And my job was basically eventually I became one of the fixers in the company.
What year was that?
We got bought in 2009 and I started off running like search and geo and some other kind of AI centric teams. And then I morphed into this fixer role. We basically had a big reorg internally. And basically what happened is we did kind of a slow motion reorg, which you usually don't want to do, right? So it took like a month to reorg the product org. And Dick asked each person what they want to be doing. And most people said, I want this job or I want that job. And I showed up and I said, well, just tell me what you need me to do, right? Like, it's not about me, it's about helping this company thrive. And so half the team got fired. I got promoted for saying that / acting that way. And then I got kind of pulled into this fixer role. And so I ended up getting involved with M&A, with internationalization.
When there's a problem,
right?
we just need a smart guy to work hard and help the
Yeah,
company.
just jump in, help fix something, maybe help hire in the exec, and then go on and do the next thing.
And I want to ask, just because it's got to be on a lot of people's minds, and I don't want to focus too much on this culture war stuff, but like when Elon bought Twitter and became X, my friends went in there and there were accounts like mine that were like turned down, and it was all this crazy politics, and it was very clear, it was very politicized, and it felt like that might have started more 2014, 2015. Was that going on a little bit when you were there?
No, when I was there, it was actually viewed more as a platform for helping disseminate information for freedom, right?
So it was like free speech was more on the ascent even back then.
Yeah, because it was the Arab Spring was happening on top of Twitter.
Yep.
It was starting to be used as like a news media where, I don't know if you remember, there was that famous landing of the plane in the river.
Yeah, that was a cool
The
captain.
first photo for that ended up on Twitter. And so it was just emerging as a sort of real-time news media.
Captain Sully, I think he was called.
Yeah, that's right. And so in that era, there was also a lot of ex-Google people at Twitter, particularly on the legal team, and they came from this mindset of what's fair use and how do you create more access to information.
It's very much the old kind of like classical liberal Silicon Valley or for freedom and free speech and everything. So that's fascinating. So you never experienced any of that other mess.
No,
you were just all aligned.
Yeah.
What did you leave there? You went to leave to build something?
Yeah, I wanted to start a company. So I started a company called Color, which you thankfully helped back. So I really appreciate all your support over the years on that. And it was basically a really early cancer genomics and digital health company that was focused on helping people get really key information about their health, particularly around genetic risk of cancer and related areas.
You actually have a background both in math and biology. So this is an area you know really well. I guess obviously right around 2011, 2012, there were a lot of new possibilities coming up with genomics and whatnot. What inspired you to do it?
Yeah, there was sort of three points of inspiration. I think the biggest one was just my co-founder, Ottman, who's now still running the company. He had a familial history of breast cancer. His mother had breast cancer twice. He had multiple family members die of it. And so the real driving force for us was just how do we help people get really important information that's key to their health?
Yeah.
And so that's the reason we started the company, is we wanted to help people.
And you probably know this story. It was something really inspiring for us. Is my now wife, we were dating at the time, and I think I'd like bought a couple extra tests that you guys given us like low cost, and she took one, and all of a sudden she had this like crazy risk. And 23andMe had told her she had no risk, but now all of a sudden she knows she has this crazy cancer risk. So just in case, her family took the test, and then her mother was 61 at the time. And it came back and it said 80% chance of cancer by the time you're 60 based on the results. And then so the doctor said, oh, don't worry about it. But that's really strange. You would know that. I've never seen that before. Just in case, probably at the age we should do an oophorectomy, take out your ovaries.
Yeah.
And so 3 or 4 months later, no rush, they took them out and they found stage 3 cancer.
Wow, yeah.
And so fortunately they were able to treat it and help her. She probably would have only lived a couple of years because they found it. She lived like 6 or 7 more years. She got to meet a few of her grandkids.
Yeah.
Which is really wonderful that at least you gave her another 5 years of life thanks to a $100 test. It's shocking to me healthcare is like that, where a $100 thing could just like prolong someone's life a lot.
Yeah, it's amazing how little actual preventative care helps. And by the way, the reason, like what you just said, is the reason we started the company.
No, thank you.
Right. So it's one of those things that I'm never going to regret anything about Color, simply because we were able to help people in those ways.
What didn't go well? Did you, lessons learned from it?
I mean, it's just healthcare is really hard as an industry. And there's a regulatory part of it. Honestly, people just don't want to pay out of pocket for their health. So to your point, you could pay $100, $200 and get information that may be life-saving. People don't want to do that, right? They're used to their employer paying for it or the government paying for it. And most of healthcare is chronic versus preventative. In other words, you wait for somebody to get really sick and then you try and treat them, versus saying, how do we just prevent all these things from happening to begin with?
100%. One of my neighbors who I've had on here back in Texas is Peter Attia, who's the healthcare guy. And he gave me these frameworks where it's like the average doctor will say your cholesterol is like, 60th percentile, like bad, but like it's not 90th percentile, so you don't need to do anything. Whereas a really good doctor is like, let's get it to be the very best. Let's not just leave it like okay to mediocre. Like keep pushing your health, which is, I think it's a better framework, right?
Yeah.
You keep getting healthier.
There's very basic stuff you can be doing, and people just don't know about or don't know to do. I mean, the other part of it is when you look at it, a lot of our focus from a biopharmaceutical perspective, like the new drugs we develop and things like that, often aren't going to move the needle that much, actually. And they're very important for specific diseases. But if you got rid of all of cancer and all of heart disease, I think you add something like 5 to 7 years to the average person's
Is
life.
it really only 5 to 7
It's
years?
a very small amount on a relative basis. And so you're like, okay, what's everything else? And how should we actually be thinking about extending lifespan and health span? How do you keep people healthy for longer? And we're not really doing much to develop drugs in that direction. And so I think there's big gaps in the market.
Are there things you're doing today actually in bio, since we're on the topic, that you're passionate about? Like what are types of things?
There's one company that I backed called BioAge that just went public, which I'm very excited about. I've been involved with them since the very early days. I think they may still be in their quiet period, so I don't know that there's much I can say about it. I think at a very high level, they're working on different types of drugs to help with aspects of aging, and I think that's a very exciting area overall. And they've already announced certain things, so it's worth, I think, checking them out.
Totally. While I'm in town, I'm seeing my friend Rick Klausner, who's built a bunch of these companies, and the latest stuff they're doing with epigenetics and aging. It's just it's like sci-fi. It's really hopeful for helping people.
It's very cool stuff.
I want to ask in general about your success as an investor. So you obviously, we talked a little bit about these companies you built, and you did really well at them. But I think you're probably most famous these days is for someone who's invested in, I think, maybe dozens of unicorns. You've backed some really top companies from the beginning. You mentioned Stripe earlier. I think one of the famous ones. You kind of invested in them really early on and had been a mentor to those guys. Like how did you find guys like that? How are you able to keep winning again and again and again with these early stage investments?
Yeah, I think I've been super lucky on that stuff. I think a lot of the companies that I got involved with quite early was just because I was helping out people in the ecosystem. Like I was starting a company myself, and people just started coming to me either for advice, or I was a couple of months ahead of them, or we would help each other.
You just happened to help the really talented ones, huh?
Yeah, just fell into it, So I just fell into I'm the clown car in the gold mine or whatever.
No, I don't think that's the right analogy.
But I got very lucky. So I helped out a lot of these early teams, and they just happen to be some of the biggest companies. It's Airbnb, it's Stripe. Eventually ended up helping out Coinbase and Figma and Instacart and all. And it's been a great ride.
Like, what is it about teams, for example, like Stripe, that to differentiate them from others? Like, what about what guys running that company made them special?
Yeah, I've been kind of noodling on this. I had a conversation with some folks on my team yesterday, where I was just trying to brainstorm on what are there specific signs of truly outsized successful outcomes in terms of the types of founders. And I think a lot of it is just like, do you end up in the right product market? Is the market big enough? Is it growing? Is it dynamic in the right way? And so I think half of it is just you find the right market, and some of that could be luck and some of that couldn't.
But those guys are like, I mean, obviously, I know you agree they're special, but they seem like they're like some of the leading kind of intellectuals in our
no matter
world
what,
right
you
now.
need the market, right?
Yeah.
Now, within that, there's tons and tons of people who enter these markets and do horribly, right? And so what's different? And so I almost view it as there being 3 types of founders that become hyper successful. And I'm just testing this out or spitballing it, right? I don't know if this is correct. The first one is kind of the polymathic, hyper intellectual, yet very competitive person. And that's probably Patrick and John from Stripe. Honestly, that was Larry and Sergey when I worked at Google. They were very polymathic, very deep on everything. They'd go down into the weeds on the data.
Yep.
And so I think one almost like super founder archetype is that. Yep. I think the second one is the super hardcore, extremely focused, really, really driven overdrive founder. That may be, Travis from Uber.
That reminds me of like Peter, I wish, back in the day, but when he was doing well.
Yeah, Peter was just super focused. And I think there's almost signals of those, because a lot of people in our ecosystem now, for example, are doing angel investing, or they're involved with lots of other companies while they're running their company. And that second class of founders don't do any of that. They're just, they actually say no to everything, and they're just all in on one thing in a really
Travis
good way.
is definitely that way,
Yeah, so I think that's another archetype. And there's a few people I can think of who just had massive success that I just view as incredibly focused, right?
I feel like Elon used to be more that way, because he really would say no to everything.
Yeah, some of the best founders are just, like Parker at Rippling is incredibly judicious with his time. And he's just like, he's really focused. And then I think there's a third type of founder, which is just like the network effect business. And it's just, you have something that has network effects, you're going to do well.
Even if you're a clown car.
You could be, you could be Zuck, and then you take it to the next level,
That's
right?
fair.
And you start doing things like Llama and things like that.
So Zuck maybe has a network effect plus maybe some of the polymath side or something like that.
Yeah, or just, I don't know him, so I don't know if he's on the intense focus or the polymathic side or whatever, but I'm just saying like, maybe he's sort of an overlapping archetype of like one of those things, plus you now have a network effect business, so it's a default defensible.
Have you seen a lot of more network effect businesses recently? Because network effect is a thing we always talked about a lot in consumer, obviously, and those are giant companies in our world, and there's some in enterprise. But what are you seeing in network effects these days that are exciting?
Yeah, I'm seeing less network effects and more scale effects, which are related or overlapping, where as you get more scale, you end up with cost advantages that then allow you to get more scale. You could argue maybe Stripe is in that basket, but there's also more modern versions of that, particularly in energy and other related markets. So it's back to a broader question of how do you create defensibility in a business? And there's almost like 5 or 6 common patterns of defensibility. Scale effects is one, network effects is another. Creating an ecosystem on top of your platform, like what Salesforce has done, is one.
Yep.
There may be long-term contracts and durability of those contracts, which happens, for example, in the medical distribution world. So, there's in the world of business, there's like 5 ways or 6 ways to create defensibility, and roughly everything falls into those.
Yeah, at Palantir, we always try to create network effects, and we did get a few of them going. So we got a lot of countries working over it with dozens of countries. We kind of had to be on it. I think we were really proud to sell to Israel, and it was a big deal that they bought it because they never buy anything from anyone. But I think it was probably that network effect. That, I'd like to think we're just good enough, but I think that kind of helps, And then we had like Airbus using it with all of its suppliers, and everyone had to be on it. So I think there are enterprise network effects you can do, but they do seem to be more rare these days.
Yeah, I think so. And then there's also just the scale effects we mentioned. Like I know we were both involved with Andrew really early, and that's a good example where they now have such a broad portfolio of products. They have the deep customer relationships, and that allows a flywheel in terms of the ability to continue to cross-sell different types of products.
I think you get big enough too that you get a reputation in DC, and you can like do things in DC. You know what's crazy on Anduril one? So we have this company, Saronic. I think you're also just invested in that I help build, and it's growing really fast for the Navy. And they asked us to weaponize some of the autonomous vessels, and so we reached out to a few different primes. And Anduril was so good that like within 3 days, like literally 3 days, we had the NDA signed, we had all the models, all the data, exactly how it works, sent it back to the Navy. And it was like it took multiple weeks even to get the NDA signed with like the other guys. And so it's kind of cool because the Anduril is now this thing that you can use as a prime. It's then making it grow even faster because everyone wants to work with it because it's the best.
Yeah, no, you definitely, that is one of those sort of feedback loops that's very positive for some of these businesses. And so I think everybody always underestimates the degree to which these feedback loops end up mattering and the way that it changes the velocity and trajectory of a business. And if you end up on a positive track, it keeps going. And that's also true for hiring, right? There's certain networks that you tap into that keep the flywheel going. Somebody on my team actually went back and asked, are there common schools that all the founders of the biggest companies went to over the last decade, for example?
Interesting,
right? And there's basically 3 schools that are like a huge chunk of the overall value created. And then there's maybe 5 more, and that's very dispersed.
What are the schools?
It's kind of what you'd expect, at least for entrepreneurship. It's Stanford, it's MIT, it's Harvard. And then there's sort of the next set, which is like Duke, it's Carnegie Mellon, it's a handful of places.
Did Berkeley make it?
Berkeley's on there particularly for AI and blockchain.
I'm Stanford, but it's my rival school, so I'm curious.
Berkeley, actually, it's really interesting. Berkeley has a lot of PhDs in AI who've started interesting companies.
I actually have hired quite a few PhDs in AI from Berkeley.
They're very good. And Databricks, so all the data, AI, et cetera, is like basically PhDs from Berkeley. And so there are these weird clusters or pockets of talent that go on to do interesting things. And that's actually been true throughout history, right? You go back and you look at the Renaissance, or you look at Paris in the late 1800s.
Like groups from some small town in Hungary will have like 10 of the most important mathematicians. It's crazy how it works.
Yeah, exactly. And that's true for art movements. That's true for literary movements, and it's true for technology movements.
That's amazing. A lot of the success you've talked about just right now is distilled in you have a really popular high growth handbook, right? So you published this. When that came out like in the last year or two?
It came out a couple of years ago, yeah.
What are a few lessons and frameworks from that? Can you tell us? What do you remember from that?
I mean, the High Growth Handbook is basically a book that says, say that your company starts working, how do you scale it? I saw this New York Times article today where Colin Kaepernick listed the books that are by his bedside right now, and my book was the first one listed. And I was like, wow, that's amazing that it's kind of spreading more broadly beyond just the tech ecosystem.
That's really cool.
So that was really neat, yeah.
Are some of the high growth like strategies relevant for other areas maybe as well?
Yeah, it's all about just scaling organizations, dealing with change in your organization, and then it has a lot of very tactical stuff like how to raise money or how to deal with a bad board member, or different aspects of really building out an organization. And the organization could be a technology company, it could be a nonprofit, it could be a variety of things. It's funny, when the book came out, I actually had people from all over the world reach out around different types of organizations they were scaling. I had a nonprofit in Indonesia reach out to me. I had
That's cool.
Different technology companies. So it's been a really fun ride.
That's really cool. So I guess a lot of what we're doing does apply to a lot of other fields. Huh? Is that your
There's definitely common patterns. And then I think, the only good generic startup advice is that there's no good generic startup advice. And so I think a lot of things for any organization is situational, and who's involved and who are the people and how do you want to structure it and everything else.
That makes sense. Another thing I wanted to ask you about is I think recently you interviewed Lena Khan.
Yeah.
She's not my favorite government leader. I think you were very polite to her. I think you asked her about a little bit about like really aggressive M&A enforcements. And in my experience, there's been things in biotech that are being really like hurt and set back, and things are not being cured because she's being so aggressive and blocking things. Like, what do you think of her answer about when you talked about that? I think you talked about like
Sure.
blocking Meta from acquiring a 30-person company, which seemed a little crazy to me. Do you wish you'd pushed her harder? Like, where are you on
Sure.
this?
Yeah, so we had a reasonably short interview. I mean, it was generous with her time to do this, right? We had
Yeah.
about 30 minutes. And I think there's a lot of standard questions that we asked around M&A and AI and open source and all these topics. And we just didn't have a lot of time to go deep on a lot of things. And honestly, the things I was most interested in, because I actually feel that her stance on small M&A by big tech is very well understood and known, right? It's not like we would have uncovered something new. And I almost viewed those things as the warm up. The things I wanted to ask about were things like, why aren't there young people in government anymore, right? Lena Khan got appointed at, I don't remember, 31, 32.
Yeah.
JFK, I think what was he, 27, 29 when he first became a senator?
Late 20s. Yeah.
Late 20s. The Hoover Dam was built by a 25-year-old. Like throughout history, young
America
people
was
have been-
founded by a bunch of
Yeah,
people,
exactly,
mostly in their
right?
20s and their 30s.
So where have all
Yeah.
the young people in government gone, right? And why is there no longer any sort of
What do
empowerment
you
of them?
think about that?
I asked her in the podcast, and I think it caught her a little bit off guard because that's the type of question nobody ever asked. But I think it's super interesting, right? The
Yeah.
other question I wanted to ask was, and she had an answer around millennials. I mean, about generational change and all this stuff. But like, I would have loved to keep digging on that, or I would have loved to keep digging on. And I didn't have a chance to ask these questions, right? But I think they're really interesting. Like, how do you run a government agency? Like, what's important? What do you think about? What do you consider? What would you do differently next time? And so, to me, the really interesting stuff is the stuff that she and others like her are uniquely positioned to provide insights on that just nobody asks, right? Because everybody keeps asking her about M&A. So that's the stuff I wanted to get to. And if I ever have the chance to talk with her more, I would love to get into those sorts of topics because I think they're fascinating.
Yeah, the young versus old thing is really interesting to me. One of my favorite cancer nonprofits, you might know Damon Runyon, which what they do is they take the people who made the breakthroughs when they were young, and then they let them help choose the new young people who should get a lot of money. And by all accounts, it's like 100 times more effective per dollar than what the NIH does in these areas. And I know you're not supposed to say that. It's like sacred cow. You're not allowed to attack in government. But the NIH, as you know, is packing more and more and more older and older people.
Sure.
And I think that means I think it's tied to, unfortunately, it's not having as many breakthroughs. Because by the way, there are labs run by 40, 50, 60-year-olds that deserve to be backed, that are amazing labs.
Yeah.
But I think we need to have a little bit more of the money going towards people in their 20s and 30s. It seems like maybe government in general, I think as it becomes more institutionalized, more credentialed, it's just like more careful.
Well,
like,
I think there's two things going on. By the way, the first head of the NIH was in his late 20s. When
Amazing.
So again,
but when was that? That must have been like
1800, late 1800s.
Yeah, that's great.
But again, like it's this point of why societally has that changed?
Yeah.
And actually, if you look at startup founders, the same thing has happened, right? Patrick Collison has this good point of like, we're all the young startup founders, and there's some again, and by young startup
Alexander
founders,
at scale maybe, but there's
yeah,
not too
he's the only
many.
one, right? Like generationally, you go back 10 years, and it was Patrick, and it was Zuck, and it was Dylan from Figma, and you can kind of come up with a list. Today, there's many fewer, and I'm starting to see some of them in AI emerge again, right? Which I think is interesting.
Scott Wu, I guess, is pretty young still.
Scott Wu is pretty young, but it's kind of like, where are the people who have very clear outsized success really early? And those are the people that do amazing things for 20 years after that, right? That's actually a platform then to have enormous impact.
It was very useful to build Palantir as a founder when I was 21, get
Amazing.
in my 20s, and then we can build lots of other things.
Yeah, exactly, right? And so where'd all those people go?
It is interesting. I'm seeing a lot more of my favorite companies built by people who are second, third, fourth time entrepreneurs. Are you seeing that too?
I'm seeing a bunch of that, and that's almost a negative sign, right?
It's a negative
because
sign
it's always
on
been
the-
that case. But where are all the young people for the first time who are really succeeding? And it's not about starting; it's about succeeding. And I think those are different things.
Do you think it's a cultural thing where there's like different level of risk aversion or something in the culture?
I have like
or-
3 or 4 theories, and I don't think any of them are right. Do you know what I mean? It's kind of like one theory could be it's a cultural shift where we have so much helicopter parenting that
Everyone's too cautious. and-
people are less
yeah.
resilient, or they don't take risks, or you could make an argument around how suddenly there's all these jobs at big tech that are incredibly lucrative when you're really young, and so that distracts you.
Yeah.
You know,
It would have been tough if someone offered me $500,000 a year when I was 21. I probably wouldn't have gone to start Palantir. I have to be honest. Like that's,
and so
you know,
that's maybe you would have ended up at Google or Meta or whatever.
or at least for a
at this
few
time.
years or something.
Sure.
Because who knows? Yeah.
Yeah, and then it puts you on a very different trajectory. You think
Totally.
about the world differently, right? And
Totally.
so there's this really interesting question of missing young people societally, and I don't know what the driver is. And again, Patrick, I think, has brought this up in a really crisp way, and he's probably thought about it much more.
Probably correlate with progress in important ways. You probably need to figure it out.
Yeah, it's correlated with progress in important ways. And again, I think it's about this arc of impact that some people have over their lifetime. Like, look at what Musk has done, but his first success was Zip2 in the 90s, right?
Yeah.
And that money then went into x.com/PayPal, and then that money went into rockets and cars and, compounds.
Saving civilization with politics. Just kidding. I guess.
Yeah. No, but so it's stuff like that, right? And so And you see these other arcs, right? Mark Andreessen was a phenom, right, with Netscape. And he was on the cover of Time magazine when he was what, 22, 23?
Yeah.
And then he had 2 decades to do more stuff. And so the question is, you need those early successes, I think, to have massive societal change, because then you can stick around long enough to do stuff.
No, it's true. It's true. A lot of the impact that we were having right now is because we were able to do stuff when we were
Yeah.
younger. I want to talk about AI with you. I know it's
Yeah.
like the most trite thing,
Love
but
AI.
you've been involved, I guess, in machine learning and generative AI since very, very early on. You were doing AI at Google early on. First of all, like, give us some perspective on like the investment landscape in AI right now. I'm still seeing like lots of mega rounds in a hyped bubble. I hear the costs of H100s or 200s or whatever are coming way down right now. So like what's going on? Where are we in this trend?
Yeah, I mean, AI is, in my opinion, dramatically underhyped right now.
Love it.
And I think part of that is, number one, we're seeing massive actual revenue and impact without that much adoption, right? So Azure's last quarter, they did like $28 billion in the quarter. I think they said 10 to 15% of that lift or growth was from AI products. So that would be what,
Amazing.
$2.5 billion or something.
Amazing.
Quarterly,
Yeah.
right? Amazing.
But that's the infrastructure people are building on. So people
Sure.
are paying them. So are they making are the things on top of it profitable, or are those things just raising money and
Well,
build
some
on
things on top of it are doing extremely well, right?
Mm-hmm.
Midjourney is rumored to be doing extremely well financially. There's a variety of companies that are scaling very rapidly, but it's very early days, right? ChatGPT came out less than 2 years ago, and that was a starting gun for a lot of people to realize.
GPT-3 was only 2 years, huh? Yeah, it's amazing. how fast.
ChatGPT. GPT-4 came out 18 months ago. GPT-3 came out in, I can't remember, it was 21 or
Yeah, this feels more like about 3 years, I think.
20 or something, yeah.
Yeah, okay. 2.5 years. That
But
makes more sense.
three, you could kind of see things kind of working, but 3.5, 4 was when you really saw the sea change in terms of capabilities, and then ChatGPT got slapped on top of that as sort of a post-training thing. So on the one hand, I think it's dramatically underhyped because very little adoption is still creating these massive revenue streams, but also Klarna, the fintech company, mentioned that they reduced their customer success team by 700 people by adopting AI, and they suddenly had 24/7 availability in 30 languages with a higher net promoter score, faster response time, higher customer success.
We've seen already like a lot more money go into this wave than anything else in a very long time. It used to be like
Sure.
how much money is right? Like what would it be not underhyped?
Yeah,
You know?
I think what people are really misunderstanding is what is going to be the end product. And I think the end product is units of cognition, right? You're going to be effectively paying for or renting something that's going to think or do things on your behalf. And that could be legal documents. That could be a customer success team effectively. It could be a software engineering team, which is basically bots writing code for you. And so really this is a revolution in terms of units of cognition, right? And I think that's very underthought about as actually what the product is going to be.
It's interesting because deploying it right now, for example, in the services area, I'm building a bunch of companies in that area, and it's not pure cognition. It's like right now, it's like doing things to save people tons of time and make each person able to do like 3 times or 4 times as much
That's
work
huge,
too.
right?
So it's like, for example, like an auditor, like you can bring up right away, this 10 screens are most likely to look at all around. And that way right away they see it. And that way they save them for each like 5 minutes each time, you know? And so it's saving them it's making them 3 times as fast. So so it's interesting because right now that's more man-machine symbiosis. Do you see that? That staying as man-machine symbiosis, or do you see the auditor eventually pretty soon
in
getting
the
thrown
long
out?
run, I a couple years ago, I wrote this blog post that I never published. I just never got around to polishing it. I should just put it out. I wrote this maybe 5-6 years ago, which is basically positing that there'd be like 3 eras of mankind in terms of, or 3 eras of intelligence, right? And the first era is basically people. And the second era is some hybrid era where it's if you look at the number of intelligence units or whatever you want to call it, the relative brain power, you'd have a mix of humankind and machines, and then eventually it's going to be mainly dominated by machines in terms of just sheer number of brain equivalents that'll exist out there.
Just because it's just easy to build like so many more of these things.
You can scale it fast with a bunch of chips and software. And
but the idea is these are like serving us and they're like work for us, or is the idea that at some point they're not doing that?
I mean, I don't know what the very long run looks like, but in the short run, my team actually looked at this. If you look at, for example, the services world in the U.S., or if you look at SaaS and enterprise software in the U.S. is about $500 billion a year.
Yep.
If you look at the areas of AI or the areas of services that AI can transform, it's probably $5 trillion in headcount, right? Costs. It's just paying employees.
Well, it's $5 trillion in all services in the U.S. Our best estimate's about 40% of that right now could be transformed by AI. But
and then you take a cut of that, and you take 10 to 20% of that. But our math was basically, if you say take a 10% cut and transform employee headcount costs into SaaS software, you're back to $500 billion and you've recreated the entire enterprise software market cap.
No, it's true. I think in the 2.1 trillion that we think could be addressed right now, stuff like healthcare billing, logistics billing, auditing, whatever, some legal stuff. We think already you can at least double the productivity, which would be kind of $1 trillion pulled out, right?
It's amazing, right?
Which is huge.
Yeah. And then you capture some subset of that, right?
No, so people should definitely give money to all of our funds. That's what we're going to. It's a big thing.
It's just again the unit of work that we're selling is different from we're selling. We'll eventually be selling units of productive intelligence, and that's a new type of SKU that nobody's ever thought about or had before. Because the prior waves of machine learning, I think where people misunderstand AI right now, is we've been talking about AI for 20 years. And that's because we had these prior waves of machine learning and convolutional neural networks and RNNs and GANs and all these other types of networks. But they were very different fundamental, both architecture, but also type of product. Really what those things used to be good at or still are good at is pulling out statistical associations between large data sets.
Yep.
And so they're really good at stats, is basically that prior wave. The current wave is really powerful in that it's actually understanding and generating language and images and other things associated with that. It's basically, and this is based on this new architecture called the transformer architecture, which was invented at Google in 2017. Yeah. And that's been the big transformation. So it's actually a different technology curve from what we had before, but people call both of them AI. But I think we need almost like a segmentation of these things because we're on a different trajectory right now.
When you say a curve like this, to me, it seems like the curve is more like this, but I could be totally wrong. You think it's going to, I mean, is there going to be a GPT-5 and 6 or whatever from someone else too?
Yeah.
It's going to just be exponentially better than what we have right now.
It's not only exponentially better, it's impacting other fields. So you look at what Waymo is doing for self-driving or Tesla for self-driving. They've moved over to a transformer backbone and suddenly they see dramatic improvements in what they're doing.
Elon said he got rid of all of the lines of AI just by using AI. He got rid of 300,000 lines of heuristics basically in Tesla's AI for driving, which is insane.
You just go to end-to-end AI instead of having all these little edge cases hard-coded in. And that's happening in every single field.
I want to push back because I agree it's like dramatically affecting all these fields. I agree, like I said, we're using it for services already, tripling the productivity in many cases. But that's stuff you could do with like where LLMs are today.
Sure.
And so the question is, when you go like this, the question is like, are LLMs going to exponentially keep getting better to the point that it like totally changes and improves it? Or are they hitting some kind of
they're
local
not even
maxima?
close to an asymptote as far as I can tell. And I've talked to a lot of the main researchers in the field. The way I think about it is almost like a LLM steps, right? Mm-hmm. And when you had GPT 3.5 and you went to 4, suddenly legal opened up as a vertical. Mm-hmm. I backed a company called Harvey and they showed me side by side, 3.5 versus 4. 3.5 doesn't work.
Otherwise,
It just doesn't work, right? You had a model update, suddenly you could do legal. What's the next step?
Podcast hosts.
Yeah. I think that one you could do with like GPT-1.
Oh.
But you have these steps. And so it's this ladder that you're climbing. And eventually you're going to hit a point where it can do all of human services, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's GPT-7 equivalent or 8 or 6 or 10 or whatever, but we're going to get there.
So you really don't think of it in terms of man-machine symbiosis stuff. Like stuff we're building now to do these services and win. Will those companies still be valuable in 5 years because they can replace it with AI as it goes along? Or is it going to be some new, is it going to be OpenAI itself that just owns all of those things?
It's interesting. When I diligenced Harvey, I called a bunch of big law firms. And I asked them, how do you think about this? And law firms traditionally are some of the worst software buyers in the world, right? They don't really innovate. They're locked down because of security and privacy and other very legitimate reasons. But they tend to be very bad buyers, but they were adopting Harvey really quickly. And so I asked them, like, how do you view the future of AI? Or what do you think is going to happen? And I was surprised by how thoughtful and forward thinking they were on this, where they said, look, we think the nature of a law firm will change. Yeah. Because right now we hire, I'm making it up, 50 associates every year. Yeah. And 5 of them will make it to partner. But we now think that in a couple of years, we can just hire 5 associates to begin with. But then who becomes our partners? What do they learn along the way? How do we teach them? How do we screen them? How do we have a portfolio of people so that some work out and some don't?
Yeah.
And so they're thinking about the legacy of their law firms. And they're like, we don't know how to think about this future world. But it also means maybe you have 1 senior partner and 2 associates and 30 bots.
Yeah.
And so the whole thing kind of shifts.
But it's also interesting. So with Harvey, you have the model where you're selling to a law firm. A lot of my companies, when we call them AI services, we're literally replacing like the healthcare billing firm. Like we're competing and we're doing it all ourselves, but we're doing it way better for a fraction of the cost. Like, are you seeing a lot of those companies right now?
Absolutely.
As well?
Yeah, it's both.
And I guess what's your intuition? Let's just say for the sake of argument to scare people that you're right and it's going to get way better with GPT-5, 6, 7 or their equivalents.
Yeah.
And is it the case that by GPT-7, maybe they just like do it out of their company themselves even better than our services company, and all of a sudden they're competing with us directly, or if they wanted to, or
It's always possible, but I think it comes down to like, what is the other tooling that's needed around what you're doing or what you're providing? And so the things that I'm bullish on are where you own a workflow for a vertical.
Yep.
And so everybody in that vertical is using that workflow.
So you're in the workflow directly.
Yeah. And so if you upgrade the model, it just makes that workflow better.
Yep.
And so it doesn't matter what the model
That's how I
is.
see it. Maybe challenge this model for me just really briefly. I talk about 5 layers for the AI value stack. So the bottom layer is like NVIDIA and chips and everything. The next one's the data centers that all of our friends, family offices are putting tons of money into. And then it's like the models, whether it's Elon's X or OpenAI or Anthropic. Then it's like level 4 would be the tools for deploying AI, which there's a bunch of interesting ones.
It's infrastructure,
like data infrastructure, Palantir trying to do things. There are a lot of interesting things there. And then level 5 is actually owning the workflow services company. That's where I'm building like probably a dozen things right now, which I'm sure you're doing a lot too. So which of those 5 are you most bullish on? Which are you spending time on?
Yeah, I'm mainly spending time on the top 3.
And is that the right way to talk about it?
Yeah, I mean, I have a slide that literally has that in sort of presentations I give and stuff. The bottom side of it, the chip side, I actually invested in 2 companies 7-8 years ago, thinking that there would be NVIDIA competitors, and I was totally wrong. Right?
Yeah,
like,
that was really
NVIDIA
hard. That was really hard. Yeah.
It's just so good. They're just very good. And there's still room for other players. I'm just saying, like they've really executed well. But yeah, I've mainly been focused on the top 3 of those layers. The other thing I've been doing is actually I've now backed 2 AI-driven buyouts, where the idea is you buy the asset itself and you can radically change the cost structure or increase the leverage of our organization by putting in AI in a deep way. And then that entity can go and roll up other companies in its vertical. And so I think that's very exciting.
This is what we're doing too, like with the healthcare billing and the logistics billing and other ones like that, is we'll grow organically at first, but then we'll go inorganically. And there's principles for inorganic growth with AI that are pretty crazy right now, which is what we're buying. Couple more things while we have you on AI, and you have children, as do I. The world's going to probably be very different in 10 or 20 years. Like what are you paying attention to for them? What do we do differently with education? How does this affect how I raise our kids?
Yeah, I wonder about that a lot, and I don't have a good answer. And I've asked some of the world's top researchers about this, right? Because I talk to many of them with some regularity, and I'm like, what should my kids study? What's a good thing to know in the future? So the positive of this AI wave for this kind of stuff is that eventually each person will have a custom tutor, which is helping them learn really deeply at their own pace, right? And I think AI is perfectly suited for that. And it's going to be a very exciting world where you have AI really going deep with your kid on different topics. And there's all sorts of research from the 80s that shows that kids that receive one-on-one tutoring learn dramatically faster.
It's the Aristotle, Alexander the Great framework.
It really is, right? I mean, a lot of things that happened thousands of years ago, it turns out make a lot of sense. And teaching kids one-on-one increases their performance by, I think I can't remember, it was 1 or 2 orders of magnitude, right? 1 or 2 standard deviations. Right?
Yeah, I think it's 1 or 2 standard deviations. No, I agree. A lot of the great minds of the Enlightenment and of the scientific revolution did get private tutoring. Something maybe we should be doing more of today, which is kind of interesting because back then it was very aristocratic. Now,
AI should make it democratized. Anybody should be able to get it because it should be so cheap, because it's just a machine learning system running in the background or an AI system running in the background. So I think that part of it is extremely exciting. The other question I've been thinking about is just, is there anything that, if you can afford it, that you can buy for your kids now so that it's durable into the future? Because if you imagine that AI is going to upend a lot of industries and a lot of type of jobs, and is it like land that is useful? Like what's actually worth something in the future?
Elad Gil is fun. Come on.
It's like, it's crazy to think like what's valuable 20 years from now.
We do have a lot of land around Austin.
Maybe it's Bitcoin. You just buy Bitcoin. That's what it all comes down to.
I think it's Bitcoin. I think it's like high growth areas. The land is not so bad. I think top companies that are attracting talent, right? I don't know. I feel like companies with great talent that are good at AI has to be like,
I have no predictive value of what companies will exist in 20 years. Maybe railroads, right? You could say, okay, the railroads are basically localized monopolies, right? They own the tracks. You're not going to build out the new
Warren
new tracks
Buffett agrees with you.
Yeah, seriously, it's stuff like that that's really durable. So maybe buy railroad stocks.
Just go long America. That's right. This is American optimist.
Yeah, exactly.
But nothing now to teach kids in particular. Like, is it anything in particular?
I think it's math, computer science, resilience, physical fitness. Like I feel like it's kind of that same how to write, how to think, how to express oneself creatively.
Philosophy, maybe a little bit. So I understand
Some
how
of it,
yeah.
yeah, depending on which part.
Which part? Yeah. No, don't
There's
the
a lot
crazy
of
stuff.
philosophy out there, so
That's
depends on
fair.
which.
Teaching my kids the values of liberty and order and all this stuff. And
Yeah, no, it's
founding.
like, what is the moral fabric and framework that you want your kids to be part of? And then also, I feel that some form of religious upbringing is useful, if only to protect them from fake religions sort of coming in, or modern religions
We need to inoculate them
subsuming them.
against the modern fake religious
You
stuff.
need to fill up that hole, right? And
We're
so that's
raising
probably part of it.
raising our kids Jewish. I think the tradition is really important to
Yeah.
have that. That's important. So, you're doing obviously really important work on AI and biotech and other frontiers. One of the things you're passionate about, I believe, is building inspiring new monuments, right? You think you invested in
Oh
money
yeah,
rental?
I'm just starting on that, and I'm looking to bring on somebody to help me drive that,
I
because
love it.
I don't have time to do it. But I think if you look at every society at its peak, or at least on its way up, you'd always have these large scale inspiring monuments.
You'd
built.
celebrate wins and you'd celebrate
You celebrate wins, but
greatness.
you also inspire the future. You inspire the next generation of people. It's like watching a SpaceX rocket launch, right? It's so inspiring.
My friend Rodney Cook in Georgia is the head of the National Monument Foundation, and I've helped him build a bunch of monuments.
That's
actually.
amazing. Yeah,
And
it's so
I
cool.
agree, it's really important. It's something. It's that he's more. He's a neoclassical architect, which is I love that style, and there's a lot of beauty and truth in that. But is this something where you'd want to do it in traditional ways, or do you want to do it in entirely new ways, or both? Or how do you think about
Yeah,
it?
it's a little bit of both. I mean, if you look at a lot of the really important historical ones, there's obviously the seven wonders of the ancient world and all this stuff, but also in more recent times, you look at things like the Statue of Liberty and people coming into Ellis Island as sort of a major entry point for immigration, and you'd see this inspiring statue, right?
Yep.
And the inscriptions and everything else around it. That helps motivate people to do amazing things, right? Or you look at the Eiffel Tower. And that was built for the World Fair that was held in Paris in the late 1800s. And it was supposed to be a testament to French steelmaking,
I love
right?
it.
And so that was supposed to show technology progress. It was look
Yeah.
at how we can do stuff with steel. Isn't that amazing?
You're
right?
showing it off. Do you believe in these things like the golden ratio and like ideas of beauty and stuff? That there's other those
Yeah,
things
I
to be
mean,
repeated?
we've kind of lost some form of beauty or sense of beauty in society, right? We don't aspire to make giant, beautiful artifacts.
I think our culture rejects it as well. It's like it mocks it, right?
It mocks it, and the question is why, and why would you mock something that's inspiring and creates a sense of light, a sense of hope, a sense of purpose? And I think that large-scale monuments do that, right? And so, and that's true in every society throughout history.
Well, I love that Monumental is doing a lot of things around like neoclassical and the traditions as well as trying to be inspiring. I'm totally with you on that. We actually started the American Optimist to try to push back on all the pessimism in our country.
Yeah.
What areas of innovation are you most excited about right now in terms of like positive outcomes for the world?
Sure.
Like what could the world look like in 10 or 20 years with these positive,
Yeah, I
technologies?
think there's so much exciting stuff coming. By the way, one could argue that the Sphere in Las Vegas is a good example of almost like a really interesting
it is.
modern
It
artifact,
is.
right?
It's
Yeah,
beautiful
so-
to look at when you're there. It's amazing.
Yeah, it's really cool.
fascinating.
So
Yeah.
even stuff like that, right, could be really neat if you think about how do you make that a public artwork or something else.
Let's build and inspire more people. I agree. I
No.
agree.
And then in terms of the future, I mean, obviously there's so much coming that can be incredibly positive for the world. There's sort of stuff in AI, stuff in health, stuff in education. There's a lot of different areas that we can transform society in a really positive way. I think fundamentally, we already talked about the education side and how I think AI is actually going to have huge impact there. I think from a health equity perspective, AI can be transformative there. Google released a model, I think 2 years ago, called MedPalm 2, where if you compared the answers from that model relative to physician experts, it outperformed them. In other words, if you
Yeah.
use physicians to train the model will get worse.
Yeah, the physicians are way behind now what you can do with AI, which they don't seem to acknowledge when they do their work
Well,
though.
I think it can be very additive to physicians, right? It can be a tool for them. But also imagine if anywhere in the world, if you had a device, right? And billions of people now have smartphones or equivalents. If you could take a photo of something, upload it, add some text or speak into it, and then get out a medical answer that potentially is actionable, and it's the equivalent of Stanford Medical Care or MD Anderson or whatever.
Yeah.
That's incredibly empowering for the world, right? If anybody anywhere in the world can do that, so I think that's very exciting.
If you don't have scope of practice laws, you could do a lot of cool things with that.
Yeah. So one side project that I'm working on with Shreyan, who's on my team, is we're going to take 1,000 great works that are off copyright, and we're going to translate them into 100 languages using AI, and then we're going to do an audiobook for all of them in AI. And then we're actually going to build a module where you can interact with and chat with the book in a way where it has
wow.
the intelligence of the full foundation model, but it sort of represents the book and its persona.
That's cool.
And so, we think it's almost like a modern Library of Alexandria, right? Because if you look at throughout history, public libraries have been massive public goods. And there's two threads of that. One is, how do you create access for anyone in the world through any modality? They should be able to hear it. They can read it, whatever it is. They can interact with it to gain new knowledge, right? Help summarize this chapter for me and let's talk about it, right?
This would be
Things
cool
like
for kids and everyone, though.
that. I just think it's really exciting. So that's one thing. And it could be religious works like the Bhagavad Gita or the Bible or whatever. It could be philosophical treatises. It could be works of mathematics. It could be great books, Shakespeare, et cetera. And so we think there's a broad swath of stuff that, we can incorporate as part of it. So that's another example of where I just think we have these amazing waves of technology coming, and they can be used in all sorts of ways that people aren't doing yet. And they can be incredibly powerful and empowering. So I think there's a lot to do.
Health, art, inspiration, and we have a
There's
bright
a lot going
future.
on. There's a lot to do.
All right. Well, Elad, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.